After my wife passed away, her 3 kids inherited a $35 million auto parts manufacturing empire in every single trust fund. Meanwhile, I, the man who stood by her side and supported her for 40 whole years, walked away with nothing but a rusty brass key from a bank safety deposit box. They laughed right in my face without a shred of shame. They called me the free mechanic and a glorified handyman. Then, in the middle of the coldest blizzard Detroit, Michigan had seen in years, they kicked me out of my own home. But before I turned my back on the life I built with my own hands, I looked at the faded tag attached to that key. It read, Cobra Snake Pass, Nevada. Trust me one last time, Arthur. When I finally made the grueling journey out to that barren desert, the truth hit me like a freight train. My wife hadn't left her greedy children a massive fortune at all. She had left them a ticking time bomb, and she had handed the detonator straight to me. If you are just joining this story, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you is something I never could have dreamed of after nearly half a century of loyalty and love. Sometimes the very people you raise and sacrifice everything for are the exact ones waiting to turn on you the moment you are no longer useful. If you have ever given your all to people who ended up treating you like garbage, hit that like button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because what I did next was a retaliation they never saw coming. Inside the marble-lined conference room of Sterling and Associates in downtown Detroit, the air was heavy enough to suffocate you. Outside, the blizzard was slamming against the floor-to-ceiling glass, a wild storm that perfectly matched the chilling cruelty inside the room. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, my rough, heavily calloused hands resting heavily on my knees. At 74 years old, as a veteran mechanical engineer and classic car restorer, these hands carried the story of a man who built everything from scratch, with grease, wrenches, and steel. Across the heavy walnut conference table sat Julian, Chloe, and Marcus. They were the children of my late wife, Margaret, from her first marriage. I had provided for them since they were toddlers, loving them just as if they were my own flesh and blood. Julian, now 48, was a high-powered Wall Street hedge fund manager and corporate liquidator. Clad in a tailored Tom Ford suit, he slumped back in his chair with pure arrogance. 45-year-old Chloe, a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who failed repeatedly in Silicon Valley, yet remained obsessed with a high-society lifestyle, was busy checking her makeup in her latest phone screen. And 42-year-old Marcus, drowning in a bottomless pit of crypto leverage trading, mistakenly thought I knew nothing about his massive debts as he nervously bounced his leg. Mr. Sterling, the attorney, cleared his throat. Adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses, he looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. Carefully avoiding my eyes, he took a deep breath and read the final lines of Margaret's will. The entirety of the estate, including $35 million in cash, corporate shares, and the historic estate in Grosse Pointe, shall be divided equally among Julian, Chloe, and Marcus. The room fell into a dead, chilling silence. It wasn't out of respect for a newly widowed husband, but rather a silence born of pure, unadulterated greed. Chloe let out a dramatic, theatrical sigh of relief. Marcus smirked and leaned back, locking his hands behind his head like he had just won the Powerball jackpot. Julian actually laughed out loud, a low, triumphant growl from the back of his throat. I just sat there. I didn't even blink. I waited for Mr. Sterling to turn the page. I waited for him to read my name. I was her husband. 25 years ago, when the auto industry faced a massive downturn, the two of us restructured her manufacturing plant together. I poured in my life savings, emptying every cent I made from restoring classic cars to keep her company from going under. I personally overhauled the heating and electrical systems of our estate. There had to be a trust fund, a clause, or something to acknowledge my existence. Mr. Sterling closed the heavy folder. Slowly opening his desk drawer, he pulled out a worn, small manila envelope and slid it across the polished wood toward me. "This is for you, Arthur," he whispered. His voice completely lacked the authority he had just used to announce $35 million. He looked deeply ashamed. I reached out and picked up the envelope. It felt entirely weightless. Ripping open the sealed edge, I emptied it into my palm. A rusty brass key fell out, tied to a frayed piece of twine with a faded paper tag attached. That was it. 40 years of absolute loyalty. 40 years of driving out in the middle of the night to pick up Marcus after a drunk driving wreck to clear his name, tolerating Chloe's endless maxed-out credit cards for luxury goods, and putting up with Julian's sickening superiority complex. And my reward was a rusty key. Julian stood up, casually buttoning his expensive suit. He looked down at me with absolute disdain. "Don't look so devastated, Arthur," he said, his tone incredibly patronizing. "For 40 years you were nothing more than my mother's free mechanic and a glorified handyman. You should be grateful she left you a little souvenir at all." Chloe chimed in, adjusting the Hermes silk scarf around her neck. "To be honest, Arthur, you should have seen this coming. This is family money. Deep down, you'll always be a blue-collar worker covered in grease. My mother only married you for convenience back then. You never belonged to our social class. Now, we finally don't have to play along anymore." Marcus laughed. "Yeah, old man, the free ride is officially over." A blinding rage surged through my chest, a primal urge to leap across that table and show Julian exactly how much strength was left in these calloused engineer hands. But I suppressed it. I am a man who measures twice and calculates precisely before making a move. I never waste energy on foolish people. I looked at the three of them. I looked at their expensive custom suits and high-end jewelry, all things I had secretly funded out of my own pocket when Margaret was too exhausted to handle their endless demands. I gripped the rusty key tightly. The sharp edges dug deep into my palm, and the physical pain anchored my racing thoughts. I refused to shed a single tear in front of them, or let my voice shake even a little. Staring straight into Julian's eyes, I spoke calmly. "You have absolutely no idea what it takes to build something, Julian. You only know how to squander what others built for you." Julian sneered, his face turning bright red. "Get out of the estate by tonight. I am listing the Grosse Pointe house first thing tomorrow morning, and I want all your junk and scrap metal cleared out. Don't force me to call security to throw you out right now." I stood up, adjusting the collar of my worn Carhartt canvas jacket. I turned my back on that $35 million and on the three vultures picking at their mother's memory. I walked out of that marble conference room and stepped into the biting, freezing Detroit blizzard. I didn't know it then, but the rusty key in my pocket was about to unlock a secret capable of tearing their entire world apart. The empire Julian thought he just inherited was nothing more than a fragile house of cards, waiting for a single strong gust of wind to blow it away. Driving my old Chevy pickup back to the estate through the blinding snow felt like walking to my own execution. Every mile we passed was a heavy reminder that I was being forced out of the home where I had poured half my life's energy. But I am not a man who breaks easily. I held the steering wheel tightly, this old truck being the only asset left in my name, as the wipers struggled against the heavy snow. When I finally pulled into the driveway and looked at the house I had shared with Margaret for 4 decades, my stomach twisted into knots. I hadn't just lived here. I had given this place a second life. 20 years ago, when Margaret's business hit a major crisis, we had to lay off the entire maintenance crew. I was the one who climbed onto the steep roof in sub-zero winter temperatures to patch the shingles. I was the one who stayed up all night soldering the plumbing in the basement when the boiler failed. Every brick and every wire here was soaked in my sweat. Now, the multi-million-dollar mansion was completely dark, except for a luxury Range Rover parked haphazardly in the driveway with its blinding headlights flashing. Chloe and Marcus had beaten me there. I stepped out of the truck, and the freezing snow immediately cut through my canvas jacket. Before my boots could even touch the first step of the porch, the heavy mahogany front door slammed open. Chloe stood there with her arms crossed, wearing a Moncler down jacket that probably cost more than my very first car. Behind her, Marcus was dragging 2 massive canvas tool bags and 2 old suitcases through the polished hardwood foyer. Those were my bags, filled with my old engineering blueprints and my most cherished mechanical tools, packed away from a time before these spoiled kids were even born. Without a moment of hesitation, Marcus grabbed the first tool bag and hurled it out the door. A twisted, triumphant sneer warped his face. The heavy canvas bag hit the snow-covered wooden planks of the porch with a sickening thud and slid right to my feet. The second suitcase followed immediately, crashing hard against the railing and sending a few of my flannel shirts scattering into the muddy snow below. Chloe stepped forward, standing under the massive awning I had personally installed years ago just to keep her from getting rained on while searching for her keys in high school. "You need to get out right now, Arthur," Chloe ordered, her voice completely flat, stripped of any basic human empathy. "Julian wants all the locks changed by midnight, and the private security team is already on their way. We don't have time to play games with you. Legally, you don't have a leg to stand on in this house anymore. The deed belongs to us now, and we want you long gone before the neighbors start asking questions." I stood out there in the freezing blizzard. Melted snow ran down my cheeks, soaking my collar, but my blood was boiling so hot I could barely feel the cold. I didn't drop to my knees. I didn't beg for a few more days, and I didn't ask them for a single dime of that $35 million. I just looked at the two of them standing in the warm glow of the foyer, staring down at me like I was a stray dog. I took a step up onto the porch, my heavy steel-toed boots making the wooden planks groan under my weight. Marcus took a nervous step back, bumping into the doorframe. Whenever things looked like they might get physical, he was always a coward. I locked eyes with him, my voice cutting right through the howling wind and snow. "I poured the foundation of this very porch with my own hands, while you were still wetting the bed, Marcus," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I squared every single joist just so your mother would have a safe place to sit and drink her coffee in the morning." I turned my glare to Chloe, whose hands suddenly gripped the doorknob tightly. "And those expensive private schools neither of you could even graduate from? I paid for every last cent of it," I continued, taking another step forward. "When your mother wanted to cut you off financially for throwing wild parties and buying luxury goods with her money, I was the one who talked her down. I wrote the checks to cover your tracks so you wouldn't end up facing fraud charges." Faced with that, neither of them could utter a single word. The truth was heavy, and they had spent their entire lives running away from it. Chloe's jaw clenched, her eyes darting away, unable to handle the tiny shred of guilt left inside her. "You're just a relic of the past now," she spat through her teeth, her voice shaking slightly. "Goodbye, Arthur." She stepped back inside and slammed the heavy mahogany door shut. I heard the lock engage with a sharp metallic click. A second later, the porch lights cut out, plunging me into total darkness. The blizzard seemed to pick up, as if punishing me for reasons I couldn't yet understand. I was completely isolated, a 74-year-old man standing in a freezing Detroit night, with 2 old suitcases, a bag of tools, and absolutely nothing to my name. The cold began to seep deep into my bones. For a split second, the sheer exhaustion of a 40-year marriage washed over me like a tidal wave. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out the manila envelope Mr. Sterling had handed me. The paper was already disintegrating from the snow. Peeling away the soggy pieces, I gripped the rusty brass key tightly in my rough palm. Using my thumb, I flipped over the faded tag attached to it. The ink was old, but protected under a thin layer of clear tape. Margaret's elegant handwriting was still perfectly legible. Holding it up to the dim street lamp, squinting through the driving snow, I read the final words my wife had written to me. "Cobra Snake Pass, Nevada. Trust me one last time, Arthur." I spent the rest of that night in the damp cab of my Chevy truck, waiting for the Detroit sun to rise. I didn't sleep a wink. My mind was racing, rewiring 40 years of memories, trying to find the missing puzzle piece. Margaret was an incredibly sharp businesswoman. She could be ruthless in the corporate world, but she had never been cruel to me, not once. She absolutely would not leave me a rusty key as a sick joke. I knew her better than anyone. She had built an empire from nothing, and she always had a backup plan. This key was a blueprint. I just needed to decode it. When the bank finally opened, I was the first one through the door. I didn't bother checking the joint accounts. I knew Julian and his team of corporate lawyers would have frozen them already. Instead, I went straight to the counter and pulled up my personal pension account. It was a modest fund I had quietly saved from my early days as a mechanical engineer, kept strictly for emergencies. I withdrew every single dollar. With enough cash in hand, I bought a one-way ticket to Reno, Nevada. I drove straight to the airport, leaving my truck in the long-term parking lot with the keys sitting right on the dashboard. I didn't care what happened to it. I was never coming back to this city again. Flying halfway across the country was a surreal experience. I sat in a cramped coach seat, surrounded by rowdy young people heading to Las Vegas for the weekend. They were chasing a wild party. I was chasing a massive mystery, carrying nothing but a rusty key and the heavy baggage of a broken family. If my wife wanted me in Nevada, that's where I was going. When the plane touched down in Reno, the incredibly dry, crisp desert air hit me instantly. It was a stark contrast to the bone-chilling humidity of Detroit. I found a bench near baggage claim and pulled out the paper tag. There was no actual street address, just a set of geographic coordinates written in Margaret's neat handwriting, alongside the name Cobra Snake Pass. I walked over to the airport taxi stand and showed the coordinates to an older driver. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the note, and shook his head. He told me these coordinates were deep in the wilderness, dozens of miles from the nearest highway, with no paved roads leading to them. You would need a serious four-wheel drive vehicle just to get out there. I found a rundown car rental shop near the airport and rented a weathered Jeep Wrangler. Heading east on Interstate 80, the signs of civilization quickly faded into an endless expanse of barren desert and rolling, dusty mountains. After driving for nearly 4 hours, I turned off onto a dirt road, riddled with deep ruts and jagged gravel. The isolation out here was absolute. No power lines, no cell towers, no signs of human activity at all. Just the relentless wind of the Nevada desert and the occasional tumbleweed rolling past. Eventually, I spotted a gap between two steep, red rock peaks, Cobra Snake Pass. As the Jeep bumped its way deeper into the canyon, the sight ahead took my breath away. It wasn't some grand view. I didn't see a hidden luxury villa or a fortified underground bunker. My eyes locked onto a building sitting right in the center of the valley. It was a heavily rusted, dilapidated, corrugated metal garage. The roof had partially collapsed. The metal siding was faded and peeling from the brutal desert sun, and a stripped, broken-down pickup truck sat out front. It looked like it had been abandoned for 30 years. I killed the engine and pushed the door open. The dead silence of the desert swallowed me whole. I walked slowly toward the garage, my eyes scanning the perimeter of the ruins. At first glance, it looked completely worthless. But I am an engineer. I don't just look at surfaces, I look at structures. The foundation of this garage wasn't built on loose sand. It was poured directly into solid granite bedrock. Its positioning was highly strategic, sitting right at the bottleneck of the only pass, cutting through this massive valley. Whoever owned this small, run-down piece of land essentially held the choke point to thousands of acres of undeveloped wilderness behind it. Stepping onto the creaking metal floor, I pushed open the heavy, warped iron door. The hinges screeched in protest, revealing a dim, dusty interior that smelled strongly of old motor oil. The exact moment I crossed the threshold, a sharp electronic ring broke the dead silence of the valley. I froze. It was the cheap, prepaid burner phone I had bought at the Detroit airport. Only one person had this number, Mr. Sterling. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the plastic phone, and looked at the glowing screen. It was an unknown Detroit number. I hit accept and brought the phone to my ear, staying completely silent. "Arthur, is that you?" the voice on the other end asked. It was Julian. His tone was a complete universe away from the vicious sneer he had used 36 hours ago in the marble conference room. Now his voice carried a thick, artificial warmth, the slick, practiced tone he used when trying to pitch high-risk funds to hesitant clients. I stood in the dark corner of the garage, listening to the wind whistle through the holes in the roof, letting him play his hand. "Look, old friend," Julian continued, using a term of endearment he hadn't used in 50 years. "We feel terrible about what happened yesterday. Emotions were running incredibly high, and things were said that we deeply regret today. Chloe has been crying all morning. We know Mom left you that worthless piece of dirt out in the desert. It's an absolute insult to everything you did for her over the decades, so we want to make it right. I maintained absolute silence. The heavy pause forced Julian to fill the suffocating void. Con men always talk too much when they get nervous. Listen, he said, his voice tightening just a fraction. We truly want to do the right thing for the family. This morning I had our commercial real estate team look into that remote plot of land. It's completely undevelopable. No water, no electricity, and considering the property taxes coming due, it's basically a liability. But your family, Arthur, we want to buy it off you. We are willing to wire $2 million directly into your bank account before the end of the day today. You can take that money, buy a comfortable condo in Florida, and enjoy your retirement. You'll never have to worry about money again. All you need to do is sign the deed over to us, and my legal team will handle all the tedious paperwork and transfer fees. My instincts immediately signaled a massive red flag. A cold, sharp clarity washed over my mind. I might be old, but my brain was still as sharp as a newly machined lathe blade. Why would three greedy stepchildren, who had just inherited a massive $35 million empire and joyfully thrown me out into a midnight blizzard, suddenly show mercy? Why would a high-rolling Wall Street shark like Julian be in such a desperate rush to spend $2 million on an abandoned garage he just labeled a liability? Logically, it made absolutely no sense. The plausible lie was collapsing rapidly under its own weight. They didn't want to help me retire in Florida. They needed this land. They needed it desperately, and they had to get it as fast as possible before I figured out exactly what those calloused hands of mine were holding. Margaret was a master chess player, and she had just handed me the most devastating move on the board. The $35 million they inherited in Detroit was nothing more than a flashy distraction. This broken-down garage, sitting silently in the deep wilderness of the Nevada desert, was the real jackpot. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the dry, dusty air. I didn't lash out at him. I didn't question him. I simply pulled the cheap plastic phone away from my ear, looked at the glowing screen, and hit the red end call button. I powered it down completely to ensure it wouldn't ring again, and slipped it deep back into my jacket pocket. The deep, heavy silence of the valley returned instantly, but right now it sounded louder than ever. Let those arrogant bastards sweat in their air-conditioned boardrooms. Let them try to guess what the clueless old mechanic was doing thousands of miles away. I wiped the Detroit circus entirely from my mind and walked deeper into the garage, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. I knew Margaret. She would never send me all the way out here without giving me exact directions. The key in my pocket was just the first step. There had to be something else hidden inside this rusted metal structure. I scanned the floor. As an engineer, I had spent decades studying structural layouts and hidden spaces. Walking across the oil-stained concrete, I noticed something near the back wall, deep in the shadows. There was an old automotive lift with heavily rusted hydraulic cylinders. Right beneath the base of the lift, a square section of the concrete looked slightly darker than the rest. When I tapped it with my boot, it gave off a dull, heavy thud completely different from the hollow echo of the surrounding floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the ache in my joints, and brushed away a thick layer of sand and dirt. The concrete slab was a perfectly concealed access panel. Forcing my rough fingers into the narrow gap, I pulled upward with everything I had. With a heavy scraping sound, the slab lifted, revealing a dark square opening. Embedded deep in the concrete foundation was a heavy-duty, steel floor safe. The metal surface was dull, but completely free of rust. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the brass key Margaret had left me. I brushed away the dirt from the keyhole and slid it in. It was a perfect fit. I turned my wrist, and the heavy internal locking mechanism gave a sharp, metallic click that echoed through the empty garage like a gunshot. Gripping the cold steel handle, I pulled hard. The heavy door swung open smoothly on greased hinges. Resting inside was a thick, weather-resistant briefcase. It looked incredibly expensive. completely out of place in a rundown ruin like this. I hauled it out, set it on the concrete floor, and snapped open the latches. The briefcase was packed tight with neatly organized manila folders, thick legal documents, and large geological survey maps. I pulled out the very first folder, which bore Margaret's neat handwriting. It read simply, "Our family's real legacy." I sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, just like I used to on the factory floor decades ago, and began to read. The top document was a highly confidential geological report that Margaret had commissioned over a decade ago. It mapped out the underground structure of this valley in stunning detail. My finger traced the contour lines on the map. This broken-down garage wasn't just sitting on useless rock. It sat directly on top of the only massive, ultra-high-grade lithium deposit in the region, and because of a major fault line, it also sat above an enormous artesian geothermal well. I unfolded a large commercial zoning blueprint. Because the surrounding area was protected federal land, this tiny half-acre plot of junk property sat perfectly at the bottleneck, controlling the only legal commercial access point to the massive lithium reserves beneath the valley. I pulled out the second folder. Inside were top-secret communications between Margaret's corporate attorneys and a massive overseas electric vehicle battery manufacturer. The letters detailed an aggressive multi-billion-dollar gigafactory development plan designed to turn the barren desert behind this garage into the largest lithium battery production hub in the country. But the developers faced a fatal problem. Without buying this specific piece of land, they couldn't drill for a single ounce of lithium, extract a single drop of geothermal water, or lay down a single transport road. Margaret had bought this choke point decades ago for pennies, effectively locking down the entire resource channel. My eyes fell on the final document in the folder. It was an official commercial land appraisal, updated just 3 months before Margaret passed away. The number at the bottom of the page made my breath catch in my throat. $75 million. I sat there in the absolute silence, staring at the long string of zeros. $75 million. This wasn't a worthless piece of dirt. This was the crown jewel of Margaret's business empire. The $35 million she left Julian, Chloe, and Marcus back in Detroit was pocket change compared to the absolute power sitting in this briefcase. Suddenly, Julian's desperate phone call made perfect sense. As a corporate liquidator, he must have stumbled across her recent financial records. He knew exactly what this land was worth, and he knew how desperately the gigafactory developers needed to buy it. He actually thought he could buy me off with a measly $2 million, hoping I was just a grieving, clueless old man who would be grateful for the first pile of cash thrown his way. He thought a simple phone call would let him steal tens of millions right out of my hands. He thought I was an idiot. A low, gravelly chuckle escaped my lips, echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "Margaret, you absolute genius," I whispered to the empty room. She knew exactly how greedy, shallow, and heartless her children were. She knew that the moment her heart stopped beating, they would throw me out on the street. So she set a trap. She handed them the flashy, obvious wealth to blind them with arrogance, while giving the ultimate leverage to me. She trusted me because I was the only person in her life who knew how to lay a solid foundation, and the only person who knew exactly how to dismantle a corrupt structure. I packed the documents back into the briefcase and locked it tight. The game had completely changed. I was no longer the victim left out in the cold. Carefully closing the heavy steel safe door, I slid the concrete slab back into place and brushed sand over the seams to hide the cracks. My mind was racing with possibilities, but my body suddenly gave out. The adrenaline that had carried me halfway across the country was fading, replaced by a deep hunger and a wicked thirst from the dry desert air. I stepped out of the dim garage and back into the blinding desert sun. Driving the rental jeep down the bumpy dirt road, I headed back toward civilization. I needed to find a cheap motel, get some food, and figure out a strategy to protect Margaret's trust. I pulled into the nearest dusty remote town and stopped outside a small grocery store. I grabbed a loaf of bread, some sliced ham, and 2 gallons of water. Walking up to the register, I pulled out my debit card. It was tied to my personal checking account back in Detroit, where I kept a few $1,000s for everyday expenses. I slid the card into the machine, waiting for the familiar beep. Instead, the small screen flashed a bright red error message, "Transaction declined." I frowned, thinking it was a bad read, and wiped the magnetic strip on my jacket before trying again. "Declined" flashed across the screen a second time. The young cashier gave me a sympathetic smile and suggested trying the ATM in the corner. I walked over, slid the card in, and entered my PIN. The screen loaded for an agonizingly long time before displaying a chilling message. "Account frozen. Please contact your financial institution." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Walking out of the grocery store and into the stifling heat, I pulled out my burner phone and dialed the customer service number on the back of the card. After navigating a maze of automated menus, I finally reached a live agent. I gave my social security number, verified my identity, and asked why my personal account was locked. The young man on the line sounded incredibly tense. He asked me to hold, and when he came back, his voice was tight. "Mr. Vance," he stammered, "your account has been fully locked down by our fraud prevention department. Early this morning, a red flag was placed on your profile citing suspicious activity and unauthorized withdrawals." I fought to keep my voice steady, demanding to know who authorized the freeze. The representative hesitated before explaining that the flag came directly from the corporate banking division, initiated by an executive managing director of wealth management, Julian. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Julian was a senior hedge fund manager with massive leverage over regional banks. When I hung up on his insulting $2 million offer, he didn't just get angry. He weaponized his entire professional world against me. He used his connections to flag my account maliciously, locking me out of my own money. He knew I was thousands of miles away. He knew I had emptied my modest retirement fund just to buy a plane ticket. Now he was intentionally cutting off my lifeline, leaving a 74-year-old man stranded in the desert without a single cent. I ended the call staring down at the cracked asphalt. The sheer malice of what he was doing was staggering. He wasn't just trying to steal a $75 million asset. He was actively trying to break me. He wanted me starving, desperate, and begging him for mercy. I walked back into the store, put the bread and ham back on the shelves, and used the last few crumpled dollar bills in my pocket to buy a single gallon of water. Sitting on a wooden bench outside, I tried to process the sickening venom of the children I had helped raise. Just as I unscrewed the cap of the water bottle, my burner phone buzzed. It wasn't a call, but a new email notification. I opened it up. It was from Mr. Sterling back in Detroit. The subject line read, "Urgent." As I scanned the cold, clinical paragraphs, my blood ran completely cold. Julian hadn't just frozen my bank accounts. He was launching a brutal legal blitz. According to the email, Julian, Chloe, and Marcus had officially filed an emergency motion in a Michigan state court. They were asking a judge to declare me legally incompetent, claiming I suffered from severe undiagnosed dementia. They argued that I was in a state of extreme mental confusion, having wandered off to Nevada inexplicably, making me a danger to myself. They were petitioning for an involuntary psychiatric hold and full medical guardianship. If the judge approved it, Julian would gain absolute legal control over my identity, my signature, and every single asset in my name. They would lock me away in a quiet care facility, legally stealing the final gift Margaret had left me without me ever being able to fight back. Sitting alone on that wooden bench, I felt the trap closing in. I was broke, cornered in the desert, and the clock was ticking down fast. Medical guardianship, dementia. Julian was trying to erase my very existence on paper, but panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. When the load-bearing walls of a structure start to lean, you don't sit down and cry. You find a steel support beam. I forced myself to stand, my knees aching in protest. Slinging my canvas jacket over my shoulder, my mind raced back to the documents inside that floor. Safe. Hidden among the geological surveys and business letters, there had been a manila folder containing legal correspondence. The letters were signed by a local attorney out of Elko, Nevada. His name was Elias Thorne. Margaret had trusted him back then, bypassing the high-profile corporate firms Julian now controlled to quietly handle the acquisition of the Cobra Snake Pass property. If anyone in Nevada could understand the sheer gravity of my situation, it was him. Driving the rental Jeep, I headed north for nearly 3 hours before finally pulling into Elko. This small town, built on gold rushes and modern mining operations, was a completely different universe from the high-rises of Detroit. Following the address from the documents, I found a modest storefront, sandwiched between a hardware shop and an old pawn shop. There were no glass facades, no walnut-paneled waiting rooms, and no arrogant receptionists wearing designer suits. The wooden sign on the door simply read, "Thorne and Associates, Mining and Land Law." I pushed through the screen door. The office smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and tobacco. A massive ceiling fan spun lazily overhead. Sitting behind an incredibly cluttered desk was Elias. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with a thick gray beard, wearing a faded flannel shirt and dusty cowboy boots. He looked up from a heavy stack of land deeds as I walked in, his expression hardened and uninviting. Standing in front of his desk, I was acutely aware of what I looked like. A 74-year-old man from Detroit, wearing a cheap shirt, completely exhausted, dead broke, and holding nothing but a plastic water bottle. "Can I help you, partner?" Elias asked, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. His tone was polite but firm, the kind reserved for turning away lost tourists. I cleared my throat, forcing my breathing to steady. "My name is Arthur Vance," I began, my voice low and solid. "I need legal representation. I own a plot of land in Cobra Snake Pass, and my stepchildren are currently filing an emergency motion in Detroit to strip me of the deed by having me declared mentally incompetent." Elias leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with deep skepticism. "With all due respect, Mr. Vance," he said slowly, "I don't handle out-of-state family disputes. If your kids are trying to put you in a home, you need a medical defense lawyer, not a land attorney. Besides, I don't take walk-ins, especially ones who look like they just crawled out of an abandoned mine shaft. The door is right behind you." He reached for his pen, making it clear the conversation was over, but I didn't move. My steel-toed boots remained firmly planted on his scratched floor. "I don't have a hotel room to go to," I said, my voice hardening into the commanding tone I used to run chaotic factory floors. "My bank accounts were completely frozen by a wealth management director in Detroit. I don't have a single cent to my name, and I am running out of time before a judge strips away my basic rights." Elias let out a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, I sympathize with your situation." "Truly," he replied, his patience wearing thin. "But people come to Nevada every day trying to run away from their problems. I'm busy protecting local land from corporate developers. I don't have the time or resources to fight a massive out-of-state legal team over a family feud. Please." I knew words wouldn't be enough. Reaching into the inside pocket of my jacket, I pulled out a specific document I had taken from the safe before leaving the garage. I slid it across the cluttered desk, laying it flat in front of him. "I'm not here asking for a handout, Elias," I said quietly. "I'm here because my wife told me to trust you." Elias glanced down at the paper. It was the original bill of sale for the land. At the very bottom, signed in fading blue ink, was her name, Margaret Vance. Elias stared intensely at the blue ink on the yellowed paper. The heavy skepticism that had been plastered across his face vanished instantly, replaced by absolute concentration. Slowly, he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a microfiber cloth, and systematically wiped his reading glasses. Slipping them on, he leaned forward and held the document up to the light of the ceiling fan. The room fell into a dead silence. For a full minute, he didn't say a word. He just studied the signature, his eyes tracing the familiar curves and sharp angles of Margaret's handwriting. Finally, he let out a long breath and set the document gently back onto the desk. He looked up at me, the dismissive attitude completely gone, replaced by deep respect. "Pull up a chair, Arthur," Elias said softly, gesturing to the worn leather seat across from him. "If Margaret sent you all this way to find me, We have a hell of a lot of work to do. I sank into the chair, my muscles finally getting a moment of relief. Pulling more folded documents from my jacket, I pushed them across the desk. I told him everything, how Julian took the 35 million, the rusty key, the eviction in the blizzard, and the financial lockdown meant to starve me out. Elias listened in total silence, never interrupting once. When I finished, he picked up the new files I provided, the geological surveys and the corporate letters about the battery gigafactory. Elias began reading through the dense legal jargon. At first, his face was like stone, completely expressionless. But as he flipped to the second page, the corner of his mouth twitched. By the third page, a low rumble started deep in his chest. Suddenly, he leaned back in his wooden chair and burst into a loud, genuine laugh that echoed through the small office. I sat there confused and defensive. I couldn't understand what was so funny about my stepchildren systematically destroying my life. Noticing my expression, Elias immediately raised a hand, wiping a tear from his eye. "I'm not laughing at you, Arthur," Elias said, his voice thick with amusement. "I'm laughing at the absolute brilliance of your late wife. Margaret was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, but this is a masterpiece." I leaned forward, gripping the armrest tightly. "Explain it to me." Elias tapped his thick finger against the documents. "You think your stepchildren just inherited a $35 million empire? You think they're sitting in their Detroit mansions drinking champagne, enjoying the fruits of your blood and sweat? Think again. They are sitting on a powder keg and the fuse has already been lit." He pulled open a deep side drawer in his desk and brought out a thick sealed folder, tossing it directly in front of me. "Margaret contacted me 6 months before she passed. She knew exactly what Julian, Chloe, and Marcus were up to. She discovered that for the past 5 years they had been quietly siphoning funds from her company accounts. Julian was using shell corporations to launder money into his high-risk short funds. Marcus was draining company liquidity to cover his massive crypto debts. And Chloe was maxing out lines of credit tied directly to the company's equity. I stared at the folder in shock, barely able to speak. Margaret knew all of it? Why didn't she fire them? Why didn't she call the police? Elias smiled coldly. Because she knew that if she confronted them directly, they would drag her into endless corporate litigation and ruin her reputation right before she passed away. So she chose a far more devastating, permanent solution. She played dumb and let them keep stealing. But while they were bleeding the company dry, Margaret was secretly restructuring her entire estate. Elias leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. "That $35 million inheritance is an absolute phantom, Arthur. The Detroit estate and the corporate portfolios are incredibly over-leveraged. Every single asset she left them is tied to massive hidden debt. But that's not even the best part." He tapped the folder again. Margaret quietly gathered every single piece of evidence documenting their embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Then she submitted the entire file anonymously to the SEC and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "The federal government?" I gasped. Elias nodded slowly, letting the weight of the words sink in. "The feds have been running a highly classified criminal investigation into Julian, Chloe, and Marcus for the past 4 months. They were just waiting for the estate to clear probate, the exact moment Mr. Sterling read that will yesterday. By accepting the inheritance, your stepchildren legally took ownership of all those corrupt shell companies and the massive debts attached to them. Margaret didn't leave them a fortune, Arthur. She left them a trap, and they couldn't wait to walk right into it. They kicked you out because they thought you were a liability. But in reality, Margaret left you completely out of the will to shield you entirely from the coming federal destruction. She handed them the poison, and she gave the only clean, unencumbered asset, valued far beyond everything they stole combined, to you, this $75 million choke point right here in Nevada. I leaned back in the worn leather chair, the weight of Elias's words wrapping around my shoulders like a heavy blanket. The massive $35 million inheritance was nothing but a carefully orchestrated mirage. Margaret had essentially handed her greedy children a lit stick of dynamite and told them it was a gold candle. Meanwhile, this $75 million plot of land, the barren sand I had walked across just hours ago, was entirely real. It was clean. And according to the papers on the desk, it belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the old bill of sale, my tired eyes tracing my late wife's signature. My chest tightened at the sheer lengths she had gone to protect me. She had intentionally isolated me from a brutal federal investigation while placing the ultimate shield in my hands. Elias didn't give me much time to process the tidal wave of emotion. With surprising agility, he spun his heavy wooden chair around and flipped open a thick silver laptop on a side table. His thick fingers flew across the keyboard with the practiced speed of a man who spent his life tracking down hidden secrets. If your stepson is being pushed to this extreme, trying to come after you with medical guardianship from halfway across the country, Elias muttered, staring intensely at the glowing screen, it means his clock is ticking fast, and he is incredibly dangerous. Nobody panics and forces an emergency mental competency hearing on a Tuesday afternoon unless there's a massive financial gun pointed straight at his head. Let's see what kind of garbage Julian is hiding beneath that arrogant, custom suit. Elias began navigating through a complex web of encrypted business registries and confidential land transfer portals. The small office fell into a dead silence, save for the rapid clicking of his keyboard and the lazy hum of the ceiling fan overhead. As a veteran land attorney in Nevada, Elias possessed deep connections, allowing him to access preliminary commercial filings that hadn't even entered the public record yet. I watched the reflection of the computer screen dance across his thick lenses. The cheerful, amused look he had just worn completely vanished, replaced by a rigid, dangerous, almost predatory focus. After several long, agonizing minutes of searching, his fingers froze over the keyboard. He let out a sharp, low whistle and shook his head slowly in utter disbelief. Arthur, you are not going to believe the absolute size of the grave this little idiot has dug for himself, Elias said, spinning the laptop screen around so I could see it clearly. I leaned forward, squinting to read the dense legal text and prominent corporate logos flashing on the screen. It was a preliminary commercial land sale contract. Printed boldly at the top of the very first page was the unmistakable logo of the foreign electric vehicle conglomerate desperate for this land, and down at the very bottom of the last page, signed in bold electronic black ink, was the signature of Julian Vance. I stared at the screen, my jaw dropping as my teeth clenched. How can he legally sign a binding commercial contract for land he doesn't even own? I demanded, my voice rising in anger. Elias pointed his thick finger at a deeply buried indemnity clause within the document. Because he lied through his teeth, Elias said flatly, crossing his arms. Julian confidently represented himself to this foreign conglomerate as the sole legal executor and primary undisputed beneficiary of Margaret's entire estate. He used that $35 million inheritance as a massive financial smokescreen to prove his commercial legitimacy. He arrogantly claimed that this Nevada choke point was just a forgotten minor asset wrapped up in the larger portfolio he now fully controlled. And the foreign developers, rushing to lock down this lucrative deal to block American gigafactories from getting it, committed fatal negligence in their due diligence. To lock up the land, they foolishly agreed to Julian's demand for an immediate, non-refundable cash deposit. Elias highlighted a line of text recording a completed wire transfer. He pocketed $15 million yesterday. $15 million. Hearing that massive number sent a wave of cold sweat washing down the back of my neck. But why the rush? I asked, leaning back. If he knew he still had to strip the legal deed away from me, why sign a fraudulent contract and take the money before the land was officially his? Because Julian is drowning, Elias said, his voice dark and incredibly serious. You thought Marcus was the only one in the family with a severe gambling problem? Marcus plays with crypto. Julian plays with high-stakes international hedge funds, using them like his own unregulated private casino. I just pulled his offshore financial background files. Over the past 12 months, Julian has accumulated catastrophic, multi-million-dollar losses. He illegally leveraged his own shell companies to the absolute limit, and his ruthless creditors are finally coming to collect on those massive loans. He needed a massive injection of untraceable cash immediately to avoid violent retaliation from the people he owes. He took that $15 million deposit from the foreign conglomerate to save his skin, arrogantly assuming he could bully you into signing over the property transfer right after. He thought you were just a weak, uneducated old mechanic who would be completely powerless to stop his vicious scheme. I stared at the glowing computer screen, absorbing the absolute magnitude of Julian's fatal miscalculation. He had staked his entire professional survival on one single assumption, that I would roll over and break. He thought my age made me vulnerable, and my grief made me blind. But he forgot the most crucial detail of all. I had spent my entire life as an engineer. I knew exactly how to read a blueprint, and I knew exactly how dismantling one single key load-bearing column could bring an entire skyscraper crashing down in an instant. Elias slammed the silver laptop shut with a sharp, decisive click. "So," the veteran land attorney said, leaning forward and resting his thick elbows on the cluttered desk, "we have a few options here, Arthur. We can contact the FBI right now. Hand this fraudulent contract over to federal investigators. Let the SEC pick up your stepson before the sun goes down. It's clean, it's fast, and it will immediately stop that emergency medical guardianship he launched against you back in Detroit." I sat quietly in the worn leather chair, listening to the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan overhead. My mind drifted back to the freezing Detroit blizzard. I remembered Chloe throwing my canvas tool bag into the snow, and Marcus mocking my decades of sacrifice. I thought of Julian calling me a free mechanic, looking down at me with absolute contempt, while secretly plotting to lock me away in an asylum just to pay off his own gambling debts. A cold, heavy sense of finality took root deep in my chest. "No," I said, my voice steady, without a single shred of hesitation. "If we contact federal investigators now, he will just hire an army of expensive defense lawyers. He will argue that this was a simple administrative misunderstanding, a clerical error made under emotional distress after his mother's passing. He will find a loophole to slip through, or at least drag the court case out for years while I rot away in a psychiatric facility. I don't want him to just get caught. I want to watch him crash right into the wall he built with his own hands." Elias smiled, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his weathered face. "I was hoping you'd say that," he murmured. "So how are we playing this card, engineer?" "Reinforce the foundation," I replied. "I need you to lock this land down so tight that not even the Supreme Court justices themselves could pry it out of my hands if they tried." Elias immediately dragged a stack of fresh legal documents from his bottom drawer. For the next 4 hours, we drafted an ironclad independent trust document. We transferred the entire $75 million ownership of Cobra Snake Pass directly from Margaret's original holding company into this newly formed federally protected trust, naming me as the sole irrevocable trustee. We buried multiple layers of legally toxic clauses within the trust agreement. If anyone, including an out-of-state judge, attempted to force a sale or transfer ownership through a medical guardianship, the land would automatically and entirely be donated to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency as a permanent wildlife preserve, completely destroying any possibility of commercial mining forever. It was an impregnable legal fortress. The exact second we stamped the final signature page, the fraudulent contract Julian had signed with the foreign conglomerate became completely worthless. He had sold them a phantom plot of land that legally didn't exist. Elias generously pulled a few $100s in cash out of his own pocket to lend me, helping me get through the next few days. I thanked him, shook his thick hand, and walked out of that quiet law office with a powerful, lethal sense of purpose. But the legal trap was only half the equation. Julian and his siblings were undoubtedly still hunting for me. They wouldn't just accept defeat from thousands of miles away. They would absolutely fly out to Nevada themselves to intimidate me, relying on their usual aggressive bullying and physical threats to force me to break. I needed an undeniable piece of hard evidence, an ironclad recording of their extortion captured right here within Nevada's jurisdiction. I walked down the street to a large local hardware and electronic supply store. Using the cash Elias had lent me, I purchased 4 high-definition, battery-powered hidden security cameras, a digital audio recording system, and some basic hand tools. Driving the rental Jeep, I made it back to that isolated valley, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, bleeding deep shades of purple and burnt orange across the desert sky. I stepped back inside the rusted, corrugated metal garage, but this time I didn't see a crumbling ruin. I saw a perfect hunting ground. I worked through the entire night by the dim glow of a small camping lantern, my calloused hands moving with practiced mechanical efficiency. I mounted the first hidden camera high up on the steel support beams of the roof, angling the wide lens to ensure it covered the entire main entrance and the cracked concrete floor below. I tucked the second camera beneath the rusted eaves of the front door, positioning it precisely to capture the face of anyone approaching from the dirt road. I strategically placed the digital audio recorders beneath the old workbench and behind a pile of scrap tires in the corner. I tested every single device, ensuring the red recording lights were heavily masked with black electrical tape and that the microphones could catch even the faintest whisper. By midnight, the old garage was completely wired, with an absolute zero blind spot surveillance network. I sat down on the oil-stained steps, my exhausted back resting against the solid steel wall, listening to the desert wind howl outside. I was no longer a broken, desperate old man being hunted by a powerful family. I was a predator waiting in the shadows, patiently watching for the arrogant wolves to blindside themselves right into my territory. The morning desert sun broke over the desolate valley, casting peaceful shadows across the red rock. I sat at an old iron table in the center of the garage, drinking black coffee I had brewed on a portable camp stove. My prepaid phone lay silently next to my cup. I knew it wouldn't be long before they came looking for me. The sudden silence from Julian, after maliciously freezing my bank accounts, was the loudest warning sign of all. Bullies don't just retreat when their first punch misses. They regroup, escalate, and try to crush you with sheer brute force. I had spent my entire life managing complex engineering sites, dealing with corrupt inspectors and aggressive suppliers. I knew exactly how to read the extreme tension in the air right before a structure collapses, and right now, the air in this garage was thick with it. I checked the hidden cameras one final time through the monitoring feed Elias had provided, confirming the stream was recording directly to a secure cloud server. The red indicators were completely hidden. Everything was set. Around 10 in the morning, the deep silence of the valley was finally shattered. It started as a low hum echoing off the red rock cliffs, quickly transforming into the roaring thunder of heavy-duty off-road engines. I didn't move an inch from my chair. I simply turned my head, watching through the narrow cracks in the metal wall. 2 pitch-black, full-sized Escalades came roaring into the peaceful valley, kicking up a massive dust storm behind them. They looked completely out of place against the raw wilderness, a mechanical invasion of this sacred ground. The vehicles slammed on their brakes right outside the garage, their tires screeching loudly against the loose gravel. Watching through the narrow gap, I saw 5 people step out of the SUVs, completely ignoring their surroundings. Julian walked right at the front. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit anymore, but he had changed into a crisp white linen shirt and designer sunglasses, looking as incredibly arrogant as ever. His face was twisted into an ugly, predatory smirk. Right behind him came Chloe, stumbling through the gravel in her expensive boots, complaining loudly that the dry air was ruining her skin. She clutched a massive Chanel handbag like a shield, scanning the wild desert with absolute disgust. Marcus followed closely behind, drenched in sweat, obsessively checking his phone and glancing nervously over his shoulder as if his creditors were about to jump out from behind a cactus at any moment. But they hadn't come alone. Flanking the 3 siblings were 2 massive men dressed in black tactical shirts and cargo pants. They were private security, brought all the way from Detroit, muscle hired to handle the dirty work. They moved with stiff, aggressive strides, scanning the perimeter and the rundown garage. It was obvious Julian had run out of patience and legal options. He had completely degraded to pure, primitive, physical intimidation. He honestly believed that bringing two armed thugs into this isolated desert would utterly crush a stubborn old man. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warm liquid steady my nerves. My heart beat slow and heavy. I wasn't afraid of them. I was just disgusted by them. After 45 years of pouring my heart, sweat, and love into this family, this vile display was their true nature. They had traveled all the way to this desert to terrorize a 74-year-old widower simply because their own bottomless greed had backed them into a lethal corner. Julian pointed a long finger straight at the garage door and barked an order to the security guards. The two large men nodded and marched aggressively up the gravel incline toward the entrance. Julian, Chloe, and Marcus followed a few paces behind, staying safely behind their hired wall of muscle. I remained completely still at the iron table. I didn't reach for a weapon, and I didn't stand up to block the door. I let them come. Heavy boots stepped onto the rusted metal floorboards, making the entire structure groan under the immense weight. A massive shadow blocked out the front window, cutting off the bright morning light. There was no polite knock, no warning, just a sudden explosion of extreme violence. The lead security guard raised his tactical boot and kicked the old iron door with terrifying force. The rusted lock shattered instantly. He delivered a second kick, and the warped hinges tore completely away from the frame. With a deafening rip, the heavy iron door crashed inward, slamming flat against the oil-stained concrete floor and kicking up a thick cloud of dust. The two guards rushed over the wreckage immediately, hands resting aggressively on their tactical belts, their massive frames filling the narrow space. They scanned the dim interior, fully expecting to see a terrified old man cowering in the corner, begging for his life. Instead, as the heavy dust cleared, they saw me sitting calmly at the iron table, my hands resting loosely on either side of my coffee cup. I hadn't even blinked when the door exploded inward. My gaze never wavered. Julian stepped over the shattered remains of the door, with Chloe and Marcus flanking him. That arrogant smirk returned to his face, fueled by an adrenaline rush from the violent entry. Removing his expensive sunglasses, he stared at me, his chest rising and falling with excitement. He looked incredibly proud of himself, completely unaware that he had just crossed a legal red line from which there was no return. Every single second of his forced entry, property damage, and physical intimidation had just been flawlessly captured in crystal clear, high-definition video and audio. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it was permanently locked. Now it was my turn to pull the lever on the gallows. I looked straight at him, waiting for his move. Julian stood over me, casting a long dark shadow across the warped iron table. Reaching into his stark white linen shirt, he pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. With a flick of his wrist, he tore out a pre-written check and slammed it down right next to my coffee cup. The paper fluttered slightly in the humid air before settling on the table. I didn't even need to pick it up to see the bold numbers printed across the center. It was a cashier's check made out to me for $2 million. "Take a good look at that paper, Arthur," Julian commanded sharply, his voice echoing through the cramped, dusty space. "That's a 2 followed by 6 zeros. That is more money than a grease-covered, outdated worker like you has ever seen in his entire life. All you need to do right now is take a pen, sign the property transfer documents in my bag, and you can walk away from all of this completely clear. You can take this cash, buy a quiet little place somewhere, and ensure your old bones don't starve before you die." I didn't touch the check. My hands remained flat on the table, my eyes locked onto his. My silence seemed to infuriate him. The arrogant smirk on his face began to crack, replaced by a tense, aggressive sneer. He leaned forward, slamming his hands heavily onto the iron table, making the metal screech under his weight. "Don't play the tough guy with me, old man," Julian sneered, leaning so close I could smell the expensive cologne radiating off his skin. "You don't have a choice anymore. I froze your pathetic bank accounts. I initiated medical guardianship proceedings in Michigan. You have absolutely nothing. No legal standing and no way out of this desert. You sign the deed over right now, or we get back in our cars and leave you here to rot. Nobody cares about you. Nobody is coming to save you. You are completely isolated out here, and if you stay, you'll die in the sand like a stray dog. As he delivered his vicious ultimatum, Chloe stepped forward from the broken doorway. She held up her expensive smartphone, the camera pointed directly at my face. On the screen, a red recording light blinked steadily. She wasn't just recording this moment for her own twisted amusement. She was gathering ammunition, trying to catch me looking confused, angry, or desperate, so they could use the footage as evidence of my mental decline for the judge in Michigan. "Say something, Arthur," Chloe mocked, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "Tell the camera how confused you are right now. Tell everyone how you wandered all the way out to Nevada because you forgot where your real home is. It's okay to admit your brain is failing you. We just want to help you, right, Julian? We just want to make sure you're safe in a nice facility where professionals can look after you." She stepped closer, circling the table like a vulture, the phone lens only inches from my face. I could see my own reflection in the dark glass screen of her phone. I looked exhausted, my gray hair disheveled by the desert wind, my flannel shirt covered in dust. I looked exactly like the broken, defeated, dementia-stricken old man they desperately needed me to be. But my eyes were cold and perfectly sharp. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I didn't yell, and I didn't break down in tears. Marcus paced nervously near the shattered doorframe, glancing out at the quiet desert every few seconds. "Just sign the damn paper, Arthur," he muttered, wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. "We don't have time to waste all day in this smelly garage. Take the $2 million and be grateful for it. Julian is being incredibly generous. You really don't want to see what happens if you force us to get rough." He pointed a shaking finger toward the two massive guards. The two security guards shifted their weight, taking another step into the room. They silently crossed their arms, amplifying the physical threat. They were the muscle, the severe consequences waiting to be unleashed if the $2 million bribe failed. Their entire presence was designed to terrify me into submission. The absolute boldness of their plan was staggering. They had broken down my door, destroyed my property, threatened my life, and were attempting to extort a $75 million plot of land for a fraction of its value. And while they did all of this, Chloe was gleefully recording a massive federal crime on her smartphone. They were so utterly blinded by their own privilege and extreme greed that they had completely lost touch with reality, naively believing federal laws didn't apply in this isolated desert valley. I let the suffocating silence stretch on for another full minute. I wanted every single threat, every mockery, and every detail of their extortion to be completely captured by the high-definition hidden camera mounted on the steel beam above. I wanted the audio recorder hidden beneath the table to perfectly catch Julian's malicious tone and Marcus's desperate impatience. When I was certain the trap had gathered enough ironclad evidence to send them all to federal prison, I slowly reached out and picked up the cashier's check. Julian let out a short, arrogant laugh, clearly believing he had finally broken my will completely. Chloe brought the camera closer, focusing on my hands holding the paper. Marcus finally stopped his endless pacing and let out a long sigh of relief. They thought they had won. They thought I had finally surrendered. But they were about to learn a brutal lesson. I held the brand new check between my thumb and index finger. The expensive paper felt heavy with their ignorant arrogance. Julian leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his chest with a smug sense of satisfaction, completely convinced that everyone in this world had a price. Chloe lowered her phone an inch, a cruel smile forming on her lips, ready to capture the moment my dignity shattered completely. Marcus wiped his sweaty hands on his expensive jeans. I looked at the three of them, these spoiled children who had spent their entire lives treating people like disposable stepping stones. And then I moved. I didn't move like a broken, confused old man. I moved with the steady, deliberate strength of an engineer who had spent half a century hauling steel and engine blocks across factory floors. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping sharply against the concrete, and slowly stood up to my full height. I am a tall man, and when I straightened my spine, it forced Julian to take a half step back. I looked down at the $2 million check in my hand. To most people, it was a fortune. To me, it was an insult. With a casual flick of my wrist, I opened my fingers and let the paper flutter down onto the dusty floor. It landed right in the dirt, directly next to Julian's polished leather shoes. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Julian barked, his arrogant smirk vanishing instantly, replaced by a wave of genuine fury and confusion. "Pick that up and sign the transfer documents, Arthur. I am absolutely not making you an offer like this a second time." I completely ignored his childish command. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my weathered canvas jacket. My fingers brushed against the cool, smooth plastic casing of the digital audio recorder I'd purchased the night before. I pulled it out and set it gently on the iron table, right next to my coffee cup. The small screen was lit up, showing the steady time code of an active recording. I tapped the thick plastic shell with my index finger, making sure Chloe's phone camera perfectly captured the device. Then I stared straight into the lens of her smartphone, keeping my voice incredibly steady, clear, and absolute. "Every single word spoken here, including your threats to leave me stranded in this desert, and your blatant attempt to extort a signature through physical intimidation, has been recorded by multiple hidden devices," I said calmly. "And that data is being uploaded in real time to a secure offsite server maintained by my attorney." Chloe gasped, her perfectly manicured hands shaking so violently that her phone nearly slipped from her grip. Panicking, she tapped her screen frantically to stop her recording, the color instantly draining from her face. Marcus stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the metal wall of the garage, pure panic spreading across his eyes. But Julian was entirely blinded by his own massive ego, completely unaware of just how deep a grave he had dug for himself. He sneered, slamming his fist onto the iron table. "You think a cheap voice recorder is going to save you?" he roared, his voice cracking from the soaring rage. "I don't give a damn if you recorded us. You're still a broke, incompetent old man. I have power of attorney in Detroit, and I've already filed for medical guardianship. Whether you sign this deed or not, I am taking this land from you. You can't stop me." I stared at him, letting his desperate rage echo through the small metal structure. When I finally responded, my voice was cold as ice. "You can't sell something you don't legally own, Julian. You have committed federal wire fraud." Those words hung in the dry desert air, heavy and lethal. Julian froze instantly, the remaining color washed out of his face, and his untouchable posture shattered into nothing. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He knew exactly what those words meant in a court of law. He knew I had looked right through his carefully constructed corporate smokescreen. Without breaking eye contact, I reached down for the heavy briefcase sitting on the floor next to my chair. I unbuckled the latches, pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Elias had finalized with me yesterday, and slammed them onto the table. The heavy paper hit the metal surface with a loud, authoritative thud. "These are the fully executed documents for an ironclad independent federal trust," I explained, my voice cutting through the dead silence like a blade. "This entire property, the land, the massive geothermal well, and the only legal commercial access channel to the lithium reserves for miles, has been fully transferred into this trust. I am the sole irrevocable trustee. The deed is locked behind a legal shield you can never penetrate. And if you or any out-of-state judge attempt to use your fraudulent medical guardianship to strip my rights, a built-in toxic clause automatically triggers, donating every single inch of this property to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. You won't get a single grain of sand." Julian stared at the legal documents, his eyes wide with absolute horror. His trembling hands reached out, turning to the signature page to see the official stamps and dates. It was over. Before he had even set foot in Nevada, the trap had been sprung. "You took a $15 million non-refundable deposit from a foreign battery conglomerate," I continued, walking around the table until I stood only inches away from his face. You signed a commercial contract promising them land you never owned in your life. You lied to federal regulators. You lied to developers. And you tried to use stolen funds to cover your catastrophic short-selling debts. The check on the floor is worthless garbage. Your medical guardianship is dead on arrival. You are completely finished, Julian. You brought a crew of thugs to make me bow down, but all you did was deliver your own neck to a federal indictment. You lost everything. The silence in the room was absolute. Julian stared at the legal documents as if looking at a venomous rattlesnake, his face a ghostly shade of white. His lips moved soundlessly, desperately trying to untangle the terrifying reality I had just built around him. But before he could fabricate a single lie, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the tense air of the rusted garage. It was Marcus's phone. In the suffocating quiet, the cheerful ringtone was deeply awkward, a jarring contrast to the devastating collapse unfolding before them. Marcus jumped, his hands shaking as he fished the phone from his jeans. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening in pure terror. "It's Mr. Sterling," he whispered, his voice cracking from panic. "Why would the estate lawyer be calling me right now?" "Answer it," I said softly, my tone completely unbothered. "Don't keep the bearer of bad news waiting." With a trembling thumb, Marcus swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello," he stammered. He never said another word. For a full, agonizing minute, Marcus just listened. I watched as a total physical collapse took over his body. His knees buckled, his shoulders sagged completely, and cold sweat poured down his forehead. His breathing turned into shallow, rapid gasps. "Oh my God!" Marcus gasped, his voice a high-pitched shriek. "What do you mean they froze everything?" Before Marcus could even process the terrifying news, Chloe's smartphone exploded with a loud ringtone as well. The sudden noise made her scream, dropping the phone straight into the dirt. She scrambled to pick it up, her manicured nails scratching wildly against the rough floor. It was her personal wealth manager. She hit the speakerphone button, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Chloe, you need to listen to me very carefully," a panicked voice blasted from the small speaker. "Federal agents just raided the headquarters in Detroit. The FBI and the SEC are tearing the entire corporate building apart. They've seized all the servers, frozen every single bank account, and completely locked down the entire $35 million inheritance." Chloe let out a breathless sob, slamming her hand over her mouth. "No, that's impossible," she wailed. "That's our money. Mom left it to us." "It was never your money," the manager shouted desperately, a faint sound of sirens echoing in the background of the call. The entire corporate portfolio was massively over-leveraged, and the company is facing a massive federal criminal investigation for tax evasion and wire fraud. And Chloe, it gets worse. That foreign battery conglomerate just contacted the firm. They discovered the deed to the Nevada property had been transferred to an independent trust before the contract was finalized. They know Julian sold them a phantom plot of land. They are filing immediate federal criminal charges over that stolen $15 million deposit. You are all completely wiped out. Do not come back to Detroit. You need to retain high-level criminal defense attorneys immediately. The line went dead. The ensuing silence was heavy enough to carry physical weight. Their destruction had arrived, not by my hands, but through the cold, unstoppable machinery of federal law. They had spent 5 years plotting in the dark, entirely unaware that their mother had already laid down the tracks to their own ruin. Marcus's phone dropped from his hand with a dull thud. He slid down the rough metal wall of the garage, burying his face in his shaking hands, breaking down into hysterical tears. The arrogant investor who threw around money on the crypto market was reduced to a weeping child. Chloe stood frozen, her expensive handbag slipping from her shoulder. She stared blankly at the wall, her mind completely unable to process the fact that her high society lifestyle, funded by endless lines of credit, was permanently over. Julian looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff, suspended in midair, waiting for the inevitable impact. He turned his head toward me slowly, his eyes hollow and dead. He had built his entire identity on fake corporate power, stolen wealth, and his ability to bully anyone in his way. Now he stood in a rundown garage, thousands of miles from home, facing a massive federal prosecution and a decade behind bars. The two security guards, who had been standing like terrifying statues, suddenly shifted their posture. They exchanged a knowing glance. They were paid to intimidate an old man, not to protect federal targets whose assets were completely frozen. Without saying a single word, the lead guard turned on his heel and walked right out of the broken doorway, his boots crunching heavily in the dirt. The second guard followed immediately, abandoning Julian, Chloe, and Marcus completely to their fate. The muscle was gone. The three cowards were entirely defenseless. I stood completely still, watching the total collapse of their empire. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I didn't feel a single wave of sadness. I felt only a deep, profound, absolute satisfaction, the exact feeling a structural engineer gets watching a flawlessly constructed, load-bearing wall do its devastating job precisely according to design. Margaret had drawn the brilliant blueprints, Elias had provided the heavy-duty materials, and I had personally swung the lethal sledgehammer. The building of their greed was completely and utterly dismantled. "You called me a free mechanic," I said to Julian, my voice cutting cleanly through Marcus's pathetic sobbing. "You thought I was just a clueless old man who didn't understand the value of $1. But you forgot the most important lesson your mother ever tried to teach you. You can never build a strong structure on a foundation of lies. Eventually, it always falls." Julian's knees gave out, and he dropped heavily to the ground, landing right next to the $2 million check he had thrown at my feet. His expensive white linen shirt was instantly covered in desert dust and cold sweat. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, all his arrogance completely destroyed. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The heavy federal hammer had already dropped, crushing them all into dust. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound inside the ruined garage was the desert wind whistling outside, and Marcus's desperate, gasping breaths as he cowered in the corner. Julian remained frozen on his knees. He stared blankly at the oil-stained concrete, his perfectly styled hair a total mess from the dry Nevada dust. The grand illusion of power he had built entirely on embezzled funds and stolen wealth had evaporated like water under the desert sun. He slowly lifted his eyes to look at me, and the contrast was staggering. The sharp, predatory gaze of the ruthless Wall Street shark was gone. In its place was the desperate, wide-eyed look of a helpless child who realized there was nowhere left to hide. His lower lip trembled uncontrollably. The massive weight of a 15-year federal sentence for wire fraud, short-selling violations, and tax evasion had finally hit his chest, squeezing out the last bit of his arrogance. He reached out his hands, clawing fruitlessly at the air between us, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. "Please, Arthur," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper I had never heard from him in all our years together. "You have to help us. You have to fix this. You know all the key players, and you have that $75 million plot of land. You can hire the best corporate defense attorneys in the country to pull us out of this. We can split the land evenly. We'll give you whatever you want. Just please don't let them send me to federal prison. I won't survive a place like that. I'm a fund manager. I'm not a criminal." He was crying openly now, massive tears rolling down his flushed face, dripping onto his expensive linen shirt. He crawled forward on his knees, his custom trousers scraping against the rough concrete and the debris of the doorframe. He looked up at me with an expression of pure, desperate deception. "Dad, please," he cried, throwing out that sacred word like a cheap bargaining chip. "You're the only father I've ever known. You raised me. You can't just stand there and watch your own family fall apart like this. We are your children." In the background, Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical wail, finally waking up from her paralyzed shock, while Marcus continued to rock back and forth in the corner. I looked down at the man begging at my boots. 45 years ago, if he had so much as scraped a knee, I would have done everything in my power to protect him. I would have sacrificed my own life just to ensure he had a warm bed and a hot meal. But every ounce of love I had ever held for this family had been systematically drained away by them, replaced by the cold reality of their cruel nature. They had thrown my old tool bags and suitcases out into a freezing Detroit blizzard, laughing at my pain. They mocked my decades of hard labor, reducing my entire existence to a convenient punchline. I felt cold steel run through my veins, freezing any lingering instinct to show them mercy. I took a slow, deliberate step back, pulling my steel-toed boots entirely out of his desperate reach. "I am not your father," I said, my voice steady, low, and absolutely stripped of warmth. "I am the man who cleaned up your messes while you mocked the calluses on my hands. I am the man you tried to lock away in an asylum just to steal a plot of land. And I am absolutely not your free mechanic." Julian collapsed completely, his forehead hitting the dusty concrete with a hollow, defeated groan. He finally understood that he had no cards left to play and no manipulations left to execute. This bridge had been burned completely to ashes by his own hands. I didn't need to say another word to him. I simply turned toward the broken entrance and gave a sharp nod toward the desolate dirt road outside. From behind the sun-bleached desert brush, a large figure stepped onto the gravel path. It was Elias. The veteran Nevada land attorney marched up to the entrance. A grim but highly satisfied smile spread across his weathered face. Right behind him were 4 fully armed Nevada state deputies. Elias had been waiting patiently just out of sight, listening to everything through the live audio feed I had established. He had heard every single threat, every extortion attempt, and the exact moment the heavy iron door was violently kicked open. The deputies stepped into the garage, hands resting cautiously on their service weapons, immediately assessing the chaotic scene. "Mr. Arthur Vance," Elias called out, giving me a respectful nod. "Are these the individuals from out of state who violently destroyed your front door and trespassed onto your private trust property?" I looked at the 3 trembling siblings and nodded. "Yes, Elias, that's them." The lead deputy stepped forward immediately, unholstering a heavy pair of stainless steel handcuffs from his belt. "Julian Vance, you and your siblings are officially under arrest for felony forced entry, malicious destruction of property, and felony extortion," the deputy announced with absolute authority. "Stand up and put your hands behind your back." Julian didn't fight it. He was completely broken. The deputy hoisted him roughly from the ground, the cold steel handcuffs clicking tightly around his wrists. Chloe screamed and tried to pull away as another deputy approached, but she was quickly subdued and cuffed alongside her ruined designer bag. Marcus surrendered without saying a single word, completely defeated by reality. I watched silently as they were marched out of my legally protected garage. The police cruisers flashed their lights, disappearing down the dusty dirt road and leaving a peaceful silence in their wake. I stood at the entrance, looking at the wreckage of the iron door. Elias stood next to me, his hands slipped casually into his pockets as he gazed out at the wilderness. "They won't be in the local cells for long," Elias said. "The charges are serious, but they're mid-level state felonies. With whatever credit they have left, they'll bail out by the afternoon. They're going to run, Arthur. They're going to try and catch the first flight back to Detroit to salvage whatever they can from that federal raid." I turned to look at him. "Let them run," I replied, "because they have absolutely no idea what's waiting for them at the finish line." I made one final request to Elias. I wanted to see it happen. I needed to witness the absolute end of their reign with my own eyes, to know that my wife's final shield had won. Elias drove me out to Reno International Airport in his truck. The terminal was bustling with sunburnt tourists and families heading out to Lake Tahoe, wheeling massive suitcases filled with souvenirs. The atmosphere was bright, cheerful, and filled with the relaxed energy of a vacation. We found a quiet spot on the second-floor observation deck, looking directly down at the main TSA security checkpoint. We waited for 3 full hours. Just as I was starting to wonder if they had rented a car to flee across state lines, the automatic sliding doors slammed open. Julian, Chloe, and Marcus came stumbling into the brightly lit departure hall. They looked completely unrecognizable compared to the polished, arrogant conquerors who had kicked down my door this morning. Chloe was dragging a heavily scuffed suitcase. her designer sunglasses sitting crooked on her face, her mascara smeared into dark rings under her eyes. Marcus was practically shaking with anxiety, looking back over his shoulder like a hunted animal, aggressively biting his thumbnail down to the cuticle. And then there was Julian. His expensive white linen shirt was stained with grease and sweat from the garage floor, his tailored jacket wrinkled and completely ruined. Yet despite looking completely disheveled, he was still desperately trying to cling to the fragile illusion of corporate superiority. He rudely pushed past tourists in line, ignoring their angry protests as he marched straight toward the priority security lane. He waved his premium boarding pass at the TSA agent, his voice loud and aggressive, trying to project the image of a high-powered executive who had no time for the rules of ordinary citizens. Chloe and Marcus pressed in close behind him, using the path he forced through the crowded line. They finally reached the security conveyor belt, and Julian began throwing his expensive leather shoes and silver watch into the plastic bins. With aggressive, irritated movements, he thought he had escaped. He thought that if he could just get on that plane, he could fly back to Detroit, hire a cold-blooded team of corporate defense lawyers, and find a way to twist the law in his favor once again. He was dead wrong. Just as Julian reached for his bag, 4 men in dark suits stepped out from behind a frosted glass partition. They moved with a terrifying synchronization and efficiency that instantly silenced the surrounding crowd. They weren't wearing police uniforms, but pinned to their belts were small golden shields. The U.S. Marshals. The lead marshal stepped directly in front of Julian, raising a single hand to halt him in his tracks. "Julian Vance," the marshal said, his voice not loud but carrying an absolute, undeniable federal authority. "You are completely surrounded. Do not attempt to resist." Julian froze instantly. For the second time that day, every single drop of color drained from his face. He looked at the marshal, then frantically scanned the terminal, searching for an exit that simply didn't exist. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest," the marshal continued, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his inside pocket. "You are facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, interstate extortion, and securities violations." Chloe's hand slipped, and her scuffed suitcase hit the polished tile floor, bursting open with a loud pop and scattering her expensive clothes everywhere. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, but a female marshal grabbed her arm, spinning her around and cuffing her hands behind her back before she could cause a larger scene. Marcus didn't even try to run. His knees buckled and he dropped straight down in the middle of the security checkpoint, burying his face in his hands, completely surrendering to his inevitable fate. But watching Julian was the ultimate reward. This arrogant fund manager, the man who had called me a free mechanic and threatened to leave me to die in the sand, was stripped of all his defenses. The lead marshal grabbed Julian's arms, forcing them behind his back. Under the rough pressure, the seams of his expensive jacket split open. The cold federal handcuffs engaged with a loud, distinct click, locking tightly around his wrists. That sound was incredibly satisfying. It was the sound of justice finally catching up to decades of unchecked greed. Tourists in the security line pulled out their phones, snapping photos and recording video, capturing the public humiliation of a millionaire being marched through an airport. Julian hung his head, desperately trying to avoid the lenses, his flawless reputation destroyed in seconds. As the marshals escorted them away toward the holding area, Julian lifted his head, his gaze sweeping across the second-floor observation deck. For one brief second, his eyes met mine. He saw me, the blue-collar engineer, standing there quietly watching his empire burn to ashes. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just looked down at him with the cold, unyielding strength of a man standing on a foundation built entirely of truth. The exact moment he was dragged out of sight, I felt the massive weight I had carried for 45 years lift completely from my shoulders. The flight back to Michigan was a trip they took in federal custody. I didn't follow them back. I stayed in Nevada, letting the dry, warm desert sun heal the freezing chill that Detroit winters had driven deep into my bones. The gears of the American justice system turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. For the next 14 months, I sat in a lawn chair outside my newly repaired garage, listening as Elias kept me updated on the case. The federal prosecutors showed absolutely no mercy, combining the flawless evidence Margaret had gathered over 5 years with the high-definition video and audio recordings I captured in the old garage. They built an absolute airtight criminal case. Julian was the first to fall. Arrogant to the very end, he refused to take a plea deal, naively believing his slick Wall Street charm could somehow move a federal judge. He spent the last of his hidden emergency cash to hire a team of aggressive defense lawyers, trying to paint himself as a grieving son who had simply made an administrative mistake right after his mother's death. But the prosecution played the tapes in open court. They played the audio of him threatening to leave a 74-year-old man to die in the wilderness. They displayed the fraudulent commercial contract he had signed with the foreign battery conglomerate, proving he had intentionally stolen $15 million to pay off his high-risk, short-selling debts. When the judge read the sentence, there wasn't a shred of leniency. For massive wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, securities violations, and interstate extortion, Julian was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison. The man who used to march through boardrooms in custom Italian suits was reduced to a number stamped onto a rough, ill-fitting set of khaki scrubs. He lost his wealth, his prestige, and his freedom. He will spend the next 15 years in a concrete cell, thousands of miles away from the luxury beach resorts and five-star hotels he thought he deserved. Chloe faced a completely different kind of prison. When the IRS seized the entire $35 million Detroit estate and all corporate assets to pay off massive tax penalties and cover the fraud, her lavish lifestyle vanished overnight. Every single one of her premium credit cards was instantly declined. Her luxury cars were towed away in the middle of the night by federal agents. Without her mother's fortune to shield her, the massive personal debts from her uncontrolled spending came crashing down on her like an avalanche. She was forced into total bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court liquidated everything she owned, including her designer handbags and expensive jewelry, just to pay off a fraction of what she owed. But her real punishment was beautifully ironic. A woman who spent 45 years looking down her nose at the working class was thrown right into the middle of it. Without a college degree or any marketable skills, Chloe was forced to take a minimum wage job at a discount clothing retailer in a rundown strip mall. The woman who threw my canvas tool bag into a blizzard now stands for 40 hours a week, folding cheap polyester shirts and dealing with rude, angry customers. She lives in a cramped one-bedroom apartment and takes the public bus to work every morning because she can't afford a car. Her pride was utterly destroyed, replaced by the exhausting real world she spent her entire life running away from. Marcus didn't fare any better. The federal raid exposed his massive network of illegal cryptocurrency trading. When the government seized his assets, they took his bank accounts, his luxury condo, and everything to his name. But it also left him completely exposed to his ruthless underground creditors. With no money left to pay his debts, Marcus was forced to turn state's evidence, testifying against a massive loan sharking ring, just to get federal witness protection. He avoided a long prison sentence, but he was left penniless. He was relocated to a dreary government halfway house in a gritty industrial town on the East Coast, far away from the glitz and glamour he used to know. He now works the night shift as a dishwasher at a greasy highway diner, with almost every cent he earns going toward court-ordered restitution. The gambler who mocked my hard labor now spends his nights bending over a sink, scrubbing burned food off ceramic plates just to afford a warm meal. They got exactly what they deserved. The universe has a strange way of balancing the scales, but in this case the balance was enforced by the full, uncompromising weight of federal law. I didn't have to lift a finger to punish them. I didn't have to seek out petty revenge. I simply stepped aside and watched the trap they built for themselves snap shut. They were consumed by their own bottomless greed. Margaret had seen it coming all along. She watched the rot spread through her own children and she knew she couldn't save them from themselves. Instead, she chose to protect the only person in her life who truly understood the value of an honest day's work. She placed the heavy, poisoned crown they desperately wanted right on their heads, while leaving a quiet, unburdened freedom for me. As time passed, the dramatic headlines surrounding the Vance family fraud case faded from the Detroit newspapers. I found a deep, thorough peace. I wasn't the free mechanic anymore. I wasn't a stepping stone for a group of spoiled, ungrateful children to walk all over. I was just Arthur, a retired mechanical engineer in the beautiful desert, holding the key to a $75 million sanctuary that would never fall into corrupt hands. The rusty key that had once felt like a cruel insult had ultimately unlocked my true redemption, proving that patience and unshakable integrity will always outlast blind, arrogant greed. With Julian, Chloe, and Marcus finally facing the terrible consequences of their actions, the shadow they cast over my life was permanently removed. But the conclusion of their criminal cases left me with a major decision regarding the Nevada property. Weeks after the airport arrests, executives from the International Battery Gigafactory contacted Elias. They were in absolute desperation. They had lost their $15 million deposit to Julian's fraud, but they still wanted the land. They officially offered me the full $75 million to dissolve the independent trust and sign over the deed. They promised an immediate wire transfer, assuring me I could take the money and live out the rest of my days in unimaginable luxury anywhere in the world. I sat in Elias's small, cluttered office, looking at the formal offer printed on thick, premium corporate letterhead. $75 million. That kind of money is heavy enough to warp a man's soul. It was exactly that kind of massive fortune that had turned my late wife's family into monsters in the first place. I had already witnessed firsthand the devastating effects that unearned wealth could have on people who lacked a solid moral foundation. I slid the formal corporate offer back across the desk to Elias and shook my head. I told him to turn them down. I didn't want their money. I had no desire to watch this pristine, breathtaking valley get dug up and turned into a massive open-pit mine. I wouldn't stand by and watch the natural geothermal wells get drained dry, or let the deep silence of this wilderness be shattered by the deafening roar of industrial machinery and heavy trucks. Elias let out a deep, knowing smile. He didn't question my decision for a single second. Instead, he pulled out a fresh stack of legal documents, and the two of us began mapping out the final phase of Margaret's ultimate design. We permanently converted the independent holding trust into a federally recognized ecological and historical mining preserve. In doing so, I legally stripped the land of any future rights for large-scale destructive commercial excavation. The massive lithium vein and geothermal reservoirs buried deep beneath the rock would never be drained just to line the pockets of a multinational conglomerate. It would remain a protected natural resource, secured by law, staying exactly as it was meant to be in the Nevada wilderness. The choke point leading into the canyon was placed under the permanent protection of the local Bureau of Land Management. I gave up $75 million without even blinking, but in doing so I locked down a massive legacy that no corporate money could ever buy. It was the ultimate absolute victory over the exact kind of bottomless greed that had consumed my stepchildren. But I didn't walk away with absolutely nothing. I reserved a tiny sliver of land use rights for myself, specifically the exact footprint where the old corrugated metal garage stood, along with the narrow dirt road leading back toward the interstate. Deep down, I am an engineer and a fixer. I had spent my entire life repairing things for other people, maintaining systems that weren't mine. Now, I finally had the chance to build something entirely for myself. I didn't hire a massive construction crew, and I certainly didn't draw up blueprints for some luxury multi-story vacation home. I drove out to the town hardware store, bought a brand new set of heavy-duty, mechanic-grade hand tools, a pile of high-quality lumber and insulation materials, and I got to work. For the first time in months, I felt truly alive. The heavy physical labor was deeply therapeutic. Every morning at sunrise, I tore away the heavily rusted metal siding and pulled down the collapsing roof beams. I reinforced the solid concrete foundation that Margaret had so foresightedly poured decades ago. I rebuilt the wooden frame walls and installed storm-resistant, insulated glass windows that looked directly out over the stunning Red Rock Valley. And across the front, I built a wide, sturdy wooden porch where I could sit and drink my morning coffee. My hands, rough and scarred from decades of hard labor, found their familiar rhythm once again. The ache in my old joints slowly faded, replaced by the deep, satisfying muscle soreness that only comes from honest, productive work. I worked straight through the dry, hot afternoons, sweat running down my face, listening to nothing but the wind whistling through the brush. The locals who had first given me directions in town would occasionally drive out to check on my progress, bringing along fresh, local barbecue. Elias would drive his pickup over on the weekends, bringing a cooler of ice-cold beer and helping me hoist the heavy wooden roof trusses into place. We became close friends, two old men who understood the silent value of protecting the things that truly matter. In less than 6 months, the rundown, rusted garage was completely transformed into a beautiful, rustic desert workshop and cabin, equipped with a full setup for classic car restoration. It was solid, secure, and built tough enough to withstand the harshest Nevada sandstorms. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar historic mansion in Detroit, but to me, it was worth more than anything else in the world. It was a home built on a foundation of absolute truth and integrity. Sitting on my newly finished porch, watching the sun slowly sink beneath the western Red Rock horizon, I finally realized the true depth of what Margaret had done for me. She hadn't just saved me from a brutal federal criminal investigation. She had given me back my dignity. She allowed me to completely sever the toxic attachment to a parasitic family that viewed me as nothing more than an ATM and a mechanic. She gave me the power to do something genuinely good for the world. And above all, she gave me a quiet, peaceful place to spend the rest of my days. Wealth was never the real prize. Freedom was. Julian had chased an empty legacy built entirely on theft and intimidation. He believed that power came from taking things away from others. But real power, the kind that lasts, comes from knowing exactly what you are meant to give back. The massive geothermal water veins beneath my new home would continue to quietly nourish this beautiful desert long after I am gone from this world. That water, those minerals, would never belong to a greedy corporation or an arrogant hedge fund manager. It belonged to the land. And for the first time in my long, complicated life, I could finally say that I belonged here too. I was finally home. The mornings out here are completely unlike anywhere else I've ever lived. Right before the sun clears the high Red Rock cliffs, a specific, incredibly deep silence settles over the entire valley. I wake up early now, not because an alarm forces me out of bed, and not because I have a frantic engineering schedule to maintain, but simply because my body finally rests easy. I walk out onto the wide wooden porch I built with my own hands, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. The smooth wood feels grounding beneath my bare feet, perfectly level and anchored securely into the ancient bedrock. I sit down in a heavy redwood rocking chair that I personally sanded down during the winter months. Taking a slow sip, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms, I look out at the crystal-clear blue sky and the vast expanse of earth before me. Everything is completely still, completely undisturbed by the mechanical roar of luxury sports cars or the suffocating, chaotic demands of corporate life back in Detroit. Occasionally, an eagle glides silently through the distant sky, hunting over the brush. The dry breeze carries the sharp, clean scent of wild sage and weathered rock. It is a profound, entirely uninterrupted sense of peace. Sitting here looking at the horizon, my thoughts naturally drift halfway across the country, back to the life I left behind in Detroit. I think about the 45 years of marriage I shared with Margaret. For a very long time, I measured the success of my life by how much weight I could carry for other people. I thought my mission was to be the quiet, unshakable foundation holding up a glamorous business empire that I never truly belonged to. I patched the holes in the roof, I quietly paid off the debts they accumulated in secret. I silently absorbed the endless disrespect from her children, constantly telling myself that love meant enduring pain without complaint. I accepted my role as a background figure, a blue-collar engineer merely tolerated at high society dinner parties. I let them call me a free mechanic because I believed that maintaining the illusion of peace was more important than protecting my own dignity. But sitting here, soaking in the quiet, warm Nevada sun, surrounded by the raw, natural beauty of this isolated sanctuary, my perspective has completely shifted. I finally understand the absolute genius behind my late wife's final act. For months, I believed that the rusty key and this hidden piece of property were simply weapons she provided, so I could execute the ultimate judgment against Julian, Chloe, and Marcus on her behalf. I thought she was using me as an instrument to destroy them, a way to punish their bottomless greed from beyond the grave. But Margaret was 10,000 times wiser than that. She hadn't just set an incredibly brilliant trap for her corrupt children. She had engineered a precise, beautiful escape route for me. She knew that if she simply left me a pile of cash or a comfortable mansion in Michigan, my deep-seated sense of duty would have kept me tied to them forever. I would have spent the final years of my life continuing to bail Marcus out of trouble with loan sharks, paying off Chloe's bankruptcies, and silently enduring Julian's ruthless arrogance. I would have slowly suffocated under the crushing weight of their endless demands. By ensuring I walked away with nothing but a rusty key, by forcing them to throw me out into a sub-zero blizzard, she shattered the invisible shackles of obligation that bound me to them. She forced them to cut the cord themselves, knowing that my pride would never allow me to crawl back and beg for their mercy. She pushed me to the absolute limit of my endurance to force me to remember exactly who I was, before wealth and toxic family politics ground me down into a tired old man. I was a tough, highly capable mechanical engineer. She forced me to fight for my own survival, and in doing so, she made me rediscover the strength that had always been inside me. Margaret hadn't just saved me from the catastrophic aftermath of that federal investigation. She had given me the ultimate gift, a freedom that carried absolutely no conditions. She gave me permission to finally stop building shelters for people who didn't know the meaning of gratitude, and to start building a life entirely for myself. I took another slow sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, heavy sense of thankfulness expand in my chest. The burning anger and bitter resentment that had consumed me during those first few weeks in the desert had been entirely swept away by the wind, vanishing into the endless horizon. I didn't hate Julian, Chloe, or Marcus anymore. I only felt a quiet, distant sadness for them. They were locked away in concrete cells, trapped in their miserable lives, completely cornered by the very greed they had spent their lives worshipping. But I was free. I sat at the edge of the world, surrounded by a breathtaking sanctuary that would remain pure and untouched long after I am gone. The massive natural reserve beneath my boots continued to sleep, a silent monument to the enduring power of nature and a reminder of how vital it is to protect the things that are real. I watched the morning sun climb higher into the clear blue sky, casting a golden light across the desert sand. I am 74 years old, but as I breathe in this clean, dry air, I feel younger and more alive than I have in decades. That rusty key was no longer a symbol of betrayal or a weapon for retaliation. It sat beautifully framed in a small wooden box, hanging on the living room wall of my new home. It was a permanent reminder of the long journey that allowed me to find myself again. Finishing the last drop of my coffee, I set the ceramic mug down on the wooden railing and closed my eyes. For the first time in 45 years, I didn't have to worry about what tomorrow might bring. I just listened to the rhythmic, comforting sound of the desert wind, resting easy in a beautiful, quiet certainty. Today I am exactly where I belong. As the sun sank completely behind the dark volcanic cliffs, painting the peaceful valley in brilliant shades of deep purple and red gold, I found myself thinking about the concept of family. For most of my life, I believed that family was defined simply by shared history and close proximity. I believed that if you provided for people, if you paid off their debts, repaired their leaking roofs, and protected them from the consequences of their own reckless choices, they would eventually learn to love and respect you. But I was wrong. Blood doesn't make a family. Respect does. The people who truly care about you don't look at your calloused hands and treat you like a glorified handyman or a free mechanic. They don't look at your advancing age and see it as a perfect opportunity to file for medical guardianship to strip away your property. True family is found in the people who stand firmly by your side when you have absolutely nothing left to offer but your company. I found more genuine brotherhood in Elias, a local land attorney I had only recently met, and in the truck driver who gave a broke old man a free ride than I did in the 3 children I spent 45 years raising. There is a profound lesson in this. It isn't just for the younger generation, but for anyone who finds themselves fading into the background of their own life. Never mistake an old man's silence for weakness. Do not look at our gray hair, our slower steps, or our quiet demeanor, and assume our minds have grown dull. We grew up in a world that didn't offer a safety net. We survived extreme economic downturns, global uncertainty, and the kind of backbreaking physical labor that most privileged modern people couldn't even imagine. We built the very foundations of the comfortable lives they now take for granted. We understand exactly what it means to measure twice and cut once. When we sit quietly at the dinner table, listening to you speak to us in a patronizing tone, it isn't because we don't understand. We are observing you. We are gathering information, calculating your character flaws, and deciding exactly how to deliver a lethal countermeasure when the perfect moment arrives. Julian thought my silence in that marble conference room meant I had surrendered. He had no idea I was simply waiting patiently for the exact right second to pull the key, load-bearing beam straight out from beneath his corrupt empire. Walking away from the people you spent a lifetime loving is incredibly difficult. It goes against every protective instinct you have as a provider. You always want to believe that if you give them one more chance, if you sign just one last check, they will finally change their ways. But people never change when you reward their toxic behavior. They only grow bolder, more entitled, and infinitely more dangerous. You must find the courage to draw a permanent line in the sand. You must look into the eyes of the people who are using you and your kindness, and tell them with absolute confidence, the free ride is permanently over. 你欠自己一个交代. You owe it to yourself to protect your own peace, your own dignity, and your own hard-earned resources. I had to lose everything I thought I owned in Detroit to finally discover the incredible, unburdened freedom waiting for me in this isolated Nevada wilderness. Margaret understood this harsh truth and threw me straight into the deepest water to force me to learn it. Now it's my turn to pass this hard-won wisdom on to you. I share this deeply personal chapter of my life because I know with absolute certainty that I am not the only one who has faced this hidden type of family betrayal. Right now, there is undoubtedly someone listening to my voice who is being manipulated by their own children. There is a hard-working parent being drained dry by ungrateful relatives, or an elderly person being intimidated into a care facility simply because their family wants to cash in on their inheritance early. If you are in that position, I want you to hear my words loud and clear. You have the absolute right to stop them. You have the right to protect your own assets, change your will, and cut off the financial supply to anyone who does not respect you. You are not a liability, and you are absolutely not anyone's stepping stone. If my story gave you even a little bit of courage to finally stand up to the people taking advantage of you, please share it. Send it to someone who desperately needs to hear that survival is possible and that justice eventually arrives. We all need a community that understands the weight we carry. That is exactly why I decided to sit out on this porch and record this story for you. So, I want to hear directly from you. Did you enjoy my story? Did you feel a wave of total satisfaction the exact moment the U.S. Marshals surrounded and took down Julian at the airport security checkpoint? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and please tell me what city you are listening from. I am sitting here in beautiful Cobra Snake Pass, Nevada, watching the stars emerge across the vast desert night sky, and knowing my voice can reach all of you around the world brings me immense joy. I'll see you in the comments section below to continue this important conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. And if this story resonated with you and you'd like to support my channel, please consider leaving a super thanks if you are able to. It helps me bring more of these raw, powerful, real-life stories into the light. Thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next story. Sending you all my love and respect.